Time to kick proceedings off. For people online, this is a bit high, for people listening online, for the benefit of those, and watching online, and for anybody else here who mightn't know, we always begin the October meeting with our AGM, but it only goes for about 5 minutes. So you needn't worry too much about it. But I've got to go through the motions with this because that's what is required of us as a charity. Okay. So what the AGM involves is the proposal by the Council of the BAA that certain officers either remain in post or that certain council members come on board, and then the secretary and the editor give short reports for your benefit, and then there's one or two other things, and then we get onto the lecture, which is what we're here for. Okay, so I'll start by saying that it's proposed that the following be re-elected to the BAA Council to serve for another year: Vice President Sarah Brown, John Cherry, Professor Eric Fernie, Dr. William Phil Masanke, Michael Flint, Martin Hennig, and Glenys Phillips. The Honorary Secretary, John McNeil. The Honorary Assistant Secretary, Susan Nettle. The Honorary Treasurer, John Irving. The Honorary Director, Lloyd De Beer. The Honorary Editor, Tom Nixon. The Honorary Reviews Editor, Costanza Beltrami. The Honorary Electronic Publications Editor, Emma Edwards. The Honorary Conference Secretary, Catherine Milburn. The Honorary Study Days Organiser, Jana Gage Silva. The Honorary Leeds IMC Organiser, Harriet Mahood. The Honorary Membership Secretary, very important, Anne Hignell. The Honorary Publicity Officer, Richard Plant. The Honorary Web Officer, Meg Bernstein. The Honorary Solicitor, Michael Flint. And the Honorary Student Representative, Rasheen Astel. So I hope I have your consent for those re-elections. Now's the time to say something if you don't consent to any of them. It's also proposed that the following be elected as ordinary members of the Council for a term: Dr. Jessica Barker, Dr. Elizabeth Hallam-Smith, Dr. Jane Spooner, and Dr. Claire Vernon retire and make way for Eric Cambridge, David Harrison, Naomi Speakman, and Lucy Rapson. It's proposed that they be elected. We offer our thanks to the outgoing members. And that the following ordinary members remain on the Council for 1 year: Katie Harrison, Carl Kinsella, David Robinson, and Laura Slater. And for 2 years, Megan McNamee, John Munns, and Deirdre O'Sullivan. Okay, I hope I have your consent for all of that. And I'll ask John to give his report. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sure. Do you need this?
Okay, I'll just hold it. Thank you very much indeed. I've sort of been secretary for quite a long time, and I do remember 1 year in which the president was voted against from the back room. So it's just a sort of second opportunity for anybody actually, if you wish to express dissent, please do so now. Otherwise, it will go down as NEMCON. Well, that's marvellous. Well, thank you very much indeed. As far as my report is concerned, then it was circulated. And of course, it's a report on our activities in 2021, which were badly interrupted by the pandemic. And that therefore we actually had no sessions here at the Antiquaries between January and May. And we made a comeback in October, and from October through to December, then we did actually have in-person meetings. It's very encouraging, I think, to look at this audience here and think back to the sort of situation that we had, at least in November and December, of last year, where there was sort of sprinkling, and we thought we'd be lucky if we got into the high teens, and you're sort of well over the high teens. So I think there is a sort of certain magnetism that's exercised by our speaker, which is wonderful to see. And we're hoping that more and more people will actually sort of start attending the meetings, as well as listening internationally. There was a certain bonus, in fact, to live streaming the lectures and moving on to a slightly different format, in that we do seem to have picked up something of an international audience. And the time at which we do these lectures is actually quite convenient, certainly for a transatlantic audience here, but also actually for a European audience. And that area of our activities is actually growing. Looking forward, then, we do have all sorts of things planned over the next 2 years, really. So we've managed to get a conference program back. And obviously this year we did have a conference which was held in Koszycza, which was a great success. And next year, then the conference will be in Chichester. We're moving to the far west of Wales, in fact, in 2024, and we're going to base a conference in Pembrokeshire in mid to late July. We haven't actually pinned down the precise dates for that yet, but we do have a rolling conference program. It's very nice to be able to announce that the biennial Romanesque conference series is progressing and continuing. And the next conference in that series will be in 2024. It will be in Valladolid, in sort of central western Spain, a city known for its lack of Romanesque monuments, but there is around Valladolid quite a few places that we can see, and it has exactly the right sort of university infrastructure for the conference, so it won't affect the conference papers as such. And a very, very good programme that's been put together by our wonderful honorary director here, Lloyd de Beer. Thank you very much.
John,
You have, yes.
but only to call on Tom Nixon to come and give his editor's report. A brief editor's report.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, and I think I'm just editor as well, not honorary editor. I tried to launch a coup against honorary X and Y last year. So just to report that this year's volume of the JBA is very nearly complete, and depending a little bit on Taylor and Francis, should be coming through post boxes, certainly before Christmas, if not before then. If you're anxious to look at articles before then, they're pretty much all online. And you can see them there, and that the volume for next year is already filling up very rapidly. So if anyone is hoping to submit something and wants it published next year, please do come and speak to me soon so that I know to look out for your paper.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. Okay, just two more brief things to do, and these are important. Oh, John, no, 3 more things to do. Maybe, John, you'd better come up and give your... I always forget something. Oh, look. For the benefit of those online, I think you'd better speak into that.
Right. I'm so sorry. Once again, the annual accounts for...
Can I just bring you... There you go.
Right. Were compiled by a former Treasurer, John Dunlop, and examined by Gary Dolphin as independent auditor. And both Mr. Dolphin and Mr. Dunlop have been very helpful to the association over the last 12 months, and Council is very grateful to them. There was a surplus in the year of 22,480. It included a very generous donation of £15,000 from John Osborne towards the International Romanesque Conference Series. Spend on transactions was low in 2021 compared to other years. No conferences could be held in the pandemic, so they don't feature in the accounts. And there were no other exceptional items of income or expenditure. After a modest fall in 2020, our investments performed well last year, up overall by 5.25%. And as for our current finances, our balances and investment income continue in a very healthy state. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Okay, so there's two brief items for which I need a seconder. It's proposed to reappoint GHD Finance of Worcester as accountants. Proposed Richard Plant, seconded John McNeill or Lloyd De Beer, take your pick, and to authorise the council to fix the remuneration of the accountants for the year ending 31st of December 2022. Proposer and seconder, yeah, okay. Proposed Emma Edwards and seconded Richard Plant. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well that's the AGM over. You'll be pleased to know it went for 12 minutes rather than 5, but anyway, let's not quibble over a few minutes. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Paul Williamson. A lot of you will know, all of you will know who Paul is, but I'm not one for these needs no introductions, because I think that there's always people out there who'd like to know more. Now, Paul is Keeper Emeritus and Honorary Research Fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and he worked at the V&A from 1979 until his retirement in 2016. First, he worked as Assistant Keeper of Sculpture, then as Chief Curator of Sculpture, a post he held for 22 years, and subsequently as Keeper of Sculpture, Metalwork, Ceramics and Glass. Various times he was also General Director of Collections for the Museum and Acting Deputy Director of the V&A in 2013. Since retirement, Paul's been cataloguing a major private collection of medieval art, the Wyvern collection, and that cataloguing enterprise has so far resulted in 3 volumes, and they go with almost 20 other books that Paul has written, perhaps the best known to present company being his magisterial survey of European Gothic sculpture in the long 13th century, which Yale published in 1995, I think. I can't remember the year. I think it's 95. And also, of course, the catalogue of the exhibition he curated with Richard Marks at the V&A in 2003, Gothic Art for England. Paul is currently guest curator for an exhibition at the Barber Institute of Fine Arts in Birmingham. That's an exhibition on their 14th century ivory romance casket and associated objects, and that will open in autumn next year. So that's something to look out for. And tonight he's going to speak to us on the title, An Open and Shut Case, Displaying Medieval Art in Private Collections. Thank you very much, Paul.
Does that work for everybody? Is that right? Good. Thank you very much, Julian and John, for those generous words. And good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many here. Lloyd had primed me for nobody coming at all because of the train strike, but I'm very grateful to you all for getting across London by tube and bus. And would also say good evening to the Zoom network, the Zoom universe out there. I don't know how many are listening, but it's a novel thing for me, and I hope you'll be able to hear me throughout. I know there have been technical difficulties in the past with other people's presentations, not for this series. So let's keep our fingers crossed that everything goes to plan. Much as I dislike lectures that begin with disclaimers about what it's not going to be covered, I should start with a confession. Tonight, I'll be saying virtually nothing about the showing of medieval art in public museums, even though many of our most important collections have been redisplayed to great effect in the last decade or so, including the V&A, the British Museum, the Burrell Collection, and the Musée de Cluny. And there's much to say about the form and structure of those displays. Nor will I be talking about the showing of medieval art in temporary exhibitions, which raises some very different issues, most notably to do with narrative content, storytelling, and visual impact. Instead, I want to offer a survey, however limited by necessity, of how certain private collectors of medieval art, from the earliest almost up to the present day, chose to keep and show the objects they so avidly gathered together, and indeed how they chose to have themselves represented. I hope it won't disappoint any of you here today that I won't be speaking of the Wyvern collection in London, with which I've been involved in the last few years, as Julian said, as I would prefer not to share details of its display in public, although it clearly does belong fairly and squarely in the long tradition of such collections, and its owner is known to many of you. But enough of what I'm not going to talk about, and on to the first slide. I imagine the image of Henry Walters on the screen in front of you is how many collectors would like to be represented. And indeed, it shows how very many of them actually were. This particular picture is in fact a careful and rather old-fashioned construct created by the splendidly named painter Thomas Cromwell Corner in 1938, 7 years after the great Baltimorean's death. And it couldn't have been arranged more artfully and with an eye to the past if it had been set up by a photographer. It is, in fact, based on a photograph, and with Walters still alive. The man is shown with his distinctive walrus whiskers, dressed in an expensive and well-cut three-piece suit, with a discreet but unmissable red lapel pin quietly denoting his elevated status. It looks to me like that for an officer of the Légion d'honneur, and in fact he was an officer of the Légion d'honneur, so it's almost certainly the case. But what marks out his distinction and good taste is on the table before him. At his right elbow is an instantly recognizable Limoges enamel casket, and in front, a late 15th or early 16th century German gilt brass figure of St. Sebastian. But he's not looking at these objects. Rather, he gazes into the distance, as if lost in thought, perhaps puzzling the place of origin of the late 12th century Mosen enamel plaque of St. Peter in his right hand. All three objects are now in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, of course. One is tempted to speculate whether the papers scattered on the desk list these and the countless other works of art he gave to the city in 1931. Regardless, the painting represents a point near to where the objects move from the private to the public domain, and when their audience changed from the privileged, invited few who might be able to handle the objects passed to them by Walters, to the general public whose access needed to be carefully mediated. As I've said, this evening I won't be talking about the public museum, but I do want to touch on the evolution from private to shared display of medieval works of art, and how one mode fed the other at different times. Before moving on from the Walters portrait, it should be pointed out, of course, that this followed a visual topos or trope for the depiction of collectors, continuing a long tradition. Going back at least to the time of Lorenzo Lotto, as seen in this portrait of a young ecclesiastic in his camerino and bedchamber of about 1530, this is in the British Museum, or Moroni's portrait of Giovanni Bressani in Edinburgh, painted in 1562. Nearer Walter's time, one only needs to refer to the two portraits of Joseph Mayer, for instance, who gave his collection to the city of Liverpool. In the first, painted in about 1840, he's in his study, sitting in a grand throne reminiscent of the Westminster coronation chair, and surrounded by his treasures, crammed onto every surface, hung on the wall, and stashed on the floor and under the table. Even the faithful spaniel has to choose his resting place carefully under Mayer's chair. Like Walters, Mayer is shown meditating on a single object, perhaps considering it in the light of something he's just read in the notebook in his left hand. But this is demonstrably a private space, an escape from the world, and a place for the enjoyment of a private passion. About 15 years later, Mayer is depicted quite differently. Now order has replaced chaos, and the serious and distinguished-looking collector stands at the threshold of his Egyptian museum in 1856, with ranks of showcases in the background. But as with the earlier portrait, one object is selected for prominent treatment. This time, it's one of the glories of the Liverpool collection, the celebrated late antique ivory diptych of Asclepius Niger, resting open at his right hand. This is it. Here is the work of art as acolyte, signalling the serious and lofty concerns of the collector. Two further examples of this type of portrait, drawn from many, should suffice to cite the image of the collector in the 19th century, and also to illustrate early manifestations of more focused collecting. Here is Alexandre Charles Sauvageot, one of the great donors to the Louvre, in his treasury in Paris in 1856, exactly the same year as the second Mayer portrait we've just seen. The room is mostly given over to glass and ceramics, primarily Palissy and Saint-Ponchaire wares. But Sauvageot, shown in the action of sliding the bolt on the door as if to quietly share with the viewer his private domain, has chosen to be depicted with a polychrome wood figure of the Archangel Michael, a Mechlin work of about 1500, and thus not really belonging in this company. Maybe he was on his way to another room in his apartment, where the arrangement was considerably less organized. You can see on the shelves on the dresser and hung on the wall a number of items apart from the painting, such as embryarchy, triptychs, and caskets up there, here, here. And even showing as well his violin propped up at his feet. He was a very celebrated violinist amongst his other gifts. I think principal violinist for the Paris Opera. You can imagine him practicing away in that rather crowded room. An English visitor to the collection, the painter Richard Redgrave, noted that, quote, "The objects were so crowded that I tucked in my sleeves from fear." Another famous collector in 19th century Paris, Alexander Petrovich Basilevsky, is shown in similar relaxed mode, but his splendid array of objects, overwhelmingly of medieval origin, have been carefully arranged taxonomically, possibly with the assistance of Alfred Darcel, a curator at the Louvre and long-term advisor to Basilevsky. This watercolor was painted in 1870 and depicts the long top-lit gallery in Basilevsky's house on the Rue Blanche in Paris, with the man himself in an armchair at the center, not studying an object, but relaxing with a newspaper. And the quiet air of repose is further emphasized by the presence of his large St. Bernard dog slumbering on the rug, fortunately with more room to spread out than Mayer's spaniel in Liverpool. The smaller works of art, now mostly in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, have been placed on shelves on specially made dressers or sideboards, with the enamels and goldsmiths' work on the left, the ivories and glass on the right, and various larger items such as a Della Robbia altarpiece, a Netherlandish retable, and a Cosmati column, and a display of swords either stand free or are wall-mounted. Those of you with eagle eyes will recognize quite a few of the pieces as being in the Hermitage, things like the Byzantine rosette casket here, the Virgin and Child. But a number of pieces from the Basilevsky collection were subsequently sold by the Soviet authorities in 1933 and ended up in other museums. The Basilevsky Situla in the V&A, for instance, was bought at that time. And this elk carving is now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In fact, was published in the Burlington magazine 4 or 5 years ago, I think. by Fritz Scholten. Given the open nature of the display, with not a vitrine in sight, it's not surprising that Basilewski was lionized for throwing open his collection to the educated public on certain days. And every collector, dealer, and antiquary of note made sure to visit it on the trips to Paris. Here the arrangement brings to mind the earlier layouts of the Wunderkammern and Kunstkammern of the 16th to 18th centuries. And at this point, it's appropriate to look back to the beginnings of the display of medieval works of art and to begin to chart, albeit and of necessity with brevity, the development of the private museum. There's been a great deal written in recent decades about the genesis of collecting and display, with outstanding contributions made by Arthur MacGregor, the late Clive Wainwright, and many others. For medieval art in particular, the cathedral treasuries are often cited as the earliest examples of the nascent museum. And it's known that most cathedrals had dedicated spaces in vestries and sacristies, indeed in treasure rooms, for the storage and safekeeping of their precious and valuable liturgical items, even without taking into account the conspicuous displays of their shrines and reliquaries in the choir, on altars elsewhere in the church, and in special processions. Alas, as far as I know, for the English cathedrals at least, none of the pre-Reformation inventories of the treasuries at Lincoln, St. Paul's in London, Canterbury, Winchester, and elsewhere says anything about the display of the items, instead simply listing them, sometimes with descriptions, sometimes not. It's certainly the case that these English lists are ordered by type, and it might follow from this that the chalices and patens, for instance, were kept on shelves in dedicated armoire or locked cupboards, as at Noyon and Bayeux, for instance, and Halberstadt, which has a very handsome cupboard of that type. And we know that the numerous copes were stored in the great semicircular cope chests that still survive at York, Gloucester, Wells, Salisbury, and Westminster Abbey. And other vestments were described as being hung on pegs in large wardrobes at Lincoln and Canterbury. But strictly speaking, these treasury spaces were not intended to make the objects accessible to the public, but to provide security, as Leslie Milner has so admirably demonstrated for Lincoln and elsewhere, even if there are rare instances of what may be described as open days at San Marco in Venice, for instance. With reliquaries, we're dealing with a different set of issues with the liturgical items than with the liturgical items. It's known that such stupendous gatherings of reliquaries as the 16th century treasury of Cardinal Albrecht von Brandenburg at Halle, the so-called Hallisches Heiltum, now dispersed and mostly lost, were shown with pride to distinguish guests by invitation. And of course, we know that most collections of reliquaries were specifically intended to be displayed and processed on certain days. Those of the Hallisches Heiltum, shown here, held in the Collegiate Church of St. Maurice and Mary Magdalene at Halle, were processed on the Sunday and Monday after the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, when indulgences were granted for those who prayed before them. The collection was certainly sufficiently valued to be worthy of the commissioning of both an illustrated printed catalogue for pilgrims in 1520 and the opulent, hand-drawn, coloured manuscript, the Hallisches Heiltums book, now in Aschaffenburg, executed for the cardinal himself in about 1525, where every piece was carefully drawn and described, although sadly there are no pictures of the settings of the objects. However, printed woodblock books of other treasuries, including those of Maastricht, Cologne, Aachen, Augsburg, and Vienna, shown here, attest to the popularity of the practice, and many surviving treasury chambers in Germany and elsewhere, very little changed, give an idea of how the reliquaries and relics were stored and displayed. I show here the relics in Hull, not Halle, as I've just been talking about. This is Hull in the Tyrol. And you can see how occasionally they were brought out and displayed to the assembled company. This is a woodcut of Hans Burgmair showing the display of the Hull relics and treasures in about 1509, 1510. You can see on the top shelf here, the top line here, some of the relics, an armed reliquary, for instance, this orb, a bust reliquary, and others as well across, being shown to the pilgrims below. The famous display cases in the treasury at Saint-Denis, engraved for Michel Felbien's History of the Abbey of Saint-Denis in 1706, are for our purposes of even greater interest, for the light they shed on the holdings of the Royal Abbey at that time. And the arrangement of the objects in showcases, raised up on internal blocks, mounted on the back wall, suspended from above in a manner still seen in a good number of museums today, may date back as far as 1560, when the cases were made in Germany. If the Saint-Denis armoire do not reveal anything of the objects displayed in the medieval period, they're nevertheless eloquent of a new approach to display, very different from the serried ranks of reliquaries ordered by a sacred hierarchy, and one that echoes that of the earliest collectors elsewhere. As said, indeed, the showing of these pieces here in 1560 was to be remarkably long-lasting. I mean, there are museums still that have objects arranged in this way with plaques on shelves and freestanding statuettes and so on, and these basic blocks to lift up the central object. Such an arrangement shares its form with the first displays in the early modern period, when vitrines came into existence, and when the first antiquarians and connoisseurs endeavoured to apply order to the study of works of art and nature. Of paramount importance in this connection is the Kunstkammer at the Schloss Ambras outside Innsbruck, which still survives largely intact, if substantially renovated. Founded by the Archduke Ferdinand II in the second half of the 16th century, the beautifully made wood showcases with glass doors still survive and are probably the oldest examples of their type in existence. Here you can see three of them back to the wall, and they are remarkable objects for their date, with these large glass windows in them. The locking mechanism is fascinating, and I did have a chance to have a good look at these, which raised as it always does, raise the suspicions of the invigilators in the room. They would now be relatively easy to open. They really only have latches which close them, which could have been secured. But now, of course, there are other security measures in place, vibrators and so on. Nevertheless, it is very good that they're still using these cases. It very much sets the atmosphere at Ambras alongside the more modern display cases that we can see there as well. The Ambras Kunstkammer contains very little from the Middle Ages, however, and its contents were divided into the four categories of artificialia, naturalia, scientifica, and antiquitates, which would be followed with little variation in the many Wunderkammern that followed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Outstanding amongst these in the 1660s and 1670s were the private museums of Manfredo Cetala in Milan, seen here, and Ferdinando Cospi in Bologna, both of which contained inter alia medieval ivory carvings, and it is of interest to note that the arrangement of Francesco Calzolare's cabinet in Verona in 1622, showing open dressers with shelves, is not so different from Basilewski's Long Gallery in 1870. By the time we reach Richard Green's museum in Lichfield, illustrated here in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1788, and which also contained medieval antiquities, We are effectively in the world of the modern museum, which could be shared with the general public without concern for the security of the objects. In a sense, a comparison of Green's Lichfield Museum, and indeed those of Cosby and Satala before him, with the display of medieval antiquities by Alexandre du Sommerard at the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris in the 1830s, illustrates the dichotomy between those wishing to declassify their collections by type, an antiquarian analysis, and collectors who wanted to use medieval antiquities to create what Clive Wainwright termed a romantic interior, the latter including such celebrated Gothic revival settings as Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill, William Beckford's Fonthill Abbey, Walter Scott's Abbotsford, and Samuel Merrick's Goodrich Court. De Sommerard, inspired by the example of Alexandre Lenoir's post-revolutionary Musée des Monuments Français in the convent of the Petit Augustin in Paris, seen here, sought to recreate the atmosphere and context in which many of the objects he acquired had originally been seen. But unlike Lenoir, he chose to live alongside his collections, and it's the creative tension set up between the two competing poles of living space versus museum display that has informed the layout of most private collections since then. In the last 2 centuries, and especially since the second half of the 19th century, most serious private collectors of medieval art have resolved this issue by choosing to separate their collections from their living spaces, usually creating dedicated rooms analogous to the Wunderkammern and studioli of the 16th and 17th centuries. This also begs the question of what exactly constitutes a collection. When does a small gathering of objects, even if of similar type, change from being essentially a decorative feature of a room to what we would recognize as a collection? Does a group of 8 alabasters count, or perhaps a dozen enamels? Perhaps a collection should only become seen as such when special arrangements have to be made to accommodate it. The increasing interest in such ordered displays from about 1850 onwards is inseparable from the scholarly engagement with medieval works of art, exemplified by the establishment of public museums and the publication of a growing number of authoritative volumes on categories of objects. It also took place against the background of a burgeoning market in medieval decorative arts, stimulated by the availability of the material as a result of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the widespread secularization of religious foundations in Italy, Spain, and elsewhere. A good number of the 19th and early 20th century collectors of medieval art played a major role in the study of the types of objects which they collected, either through publishing the pieces themselves or encouraging specialist scholars to do so for them. And this close connection between the collector and the scholar has continued to this day. It should come as no surprise that a major aspect of the enjoyment of collecting is showing objects to others with an equal interest, either fellow collectors or experts with a special knowledge of particular pieces. Alexander Petrovich Basilevsky had an exceptional collection, but his enthusiasm for making it accessible to others was typical, as was his keenness to have it published, evident by the volume he produced with Alfred Darcel in 1874. His goals differed somewhat from Alexander Schnutgen, seen here, no, not seen here, but that's one of his rooms, however, whose ambition to gather together as much as he could from Rhenish churches verged on the fanatical. This is but one of his rooms at his house on the Margaretenkloster in Cologne in the years around 1900. And it's hardly surprising that he became the principal authority on liturgical items and medieval goldsmiths' work through the first-hand study of his own collection, publishing numerous articles, mostly in the Zeitschrift für Christliche Kunst. Here he is. One can see that his collection can never have been very far from his thoughts. The most important dealers at the time, such as Frederick Spitzer in Paris in the 1880s and Brimo de Larisson in the second and third decades of the 20th century, also sought in their display strategies to overlap with the private and public realms. Spitzer's premises, seen here, were as splendidly furnished as those of any of his best clients, and when it came to publishing his holdings in 1890 to 92, it took 6 volumes prepared under the guidance of Émile Molinier of the Louvre and Alfred Darcel. and the objects were laid out on the page as if in the Louvre or the South Kensington Museum. Likewise, the items in the sale room of Brimo in Paris were displayed like in a museum, lined up in vitrines and ordered by type, one above the other. By the end of the 19th century, Paris was the undoubted centre of the world of collecting medieval art, both for the availability of the material and also for the neo-Gothic furniture in which it might be displayed. Henry Walters even furnished his Gothic room with furniture supplied by the firm Durand et Compagnie. The boom in collecting medieval art in France, and especially in Paris, was most conspicuous in those years around 1900. There were at least a dozen notable collections, the contents of which have now been absorbed into collections worldwide, both public and private. The most noteworthy would include those of Martin Leroy, which passed to his son-in-law Jean-Joseph Marquis de Vasselot, and Charles Gillot, and the Dutuis, Arcanati Visconti, Homburg, Chalandon, Garnier, Maignan, Cote, Meige, Pierre Latendrie, and Cottereau collections. Just some of the dark photographs of first Martin Leroy's collection in his house with these museum-type showcases, and then some shots of Charles Gillot's collection of about the same date. Yeah. I'm showing here, of course, only two of those named collections, but all the others were illustrated in a series of articles in the periodical Les Arts, a vital reference for the way Parisian collectors displayed their collections at the time. It's of interest to note that when Gaston Migeon wrote about the Martin Leroy collection in Les Arts in 1902, he spoke of, quote, the charm of a home where one lived joyfully among venerable objects, and everything was permeated by history, without the ensemble having the atmosphere of a museum. And it was exactly this challenge of how best to absorb medieval works of art into a domestic setting that confronted, and still confronts, the serious private collector of such pieces. An English counterpart to the Parisian collectors was Sir Julius Werner, who took advantage of the numerous sales of medieval works of art in auction sales in the years around the turn of the century, including those of the Pio, Gavet, Gibson Carmichael, Boy, Homburg, and Herschel collections. By incorporating those into his mansion at Bath House, Piccadilly, he indeed risked turning his home into a museum in precisely the way in which Gaston Migeon had alluded. But as one can see from these photographs of the so-called Red Room taken in 1911, he just about managed to avoid it. Another view of it. Sitting amongst showcases, even if they were set on a Renaissance table, as here, would not constitute many people's idea of a cosy environment. But Werner, with his interior designer, succeeded in balancing comfort with his desire to be surrounded by his recently acquired treasures. His approach is perhaps typical of a so-called Gilded Age collectors such as J. Pierpont Morgan, although Morgan himself seems never to have attempted to display the majority of his huge collection at home when he was in London, instead preferring to lend it to the Victorian Albert Museum. And of course, English Heritage, when they took over the Werner collection and displayed it at Ranger's House in Blackheath, very much tried to recreate that Gilded Age interior type in their display. Morgan's strategy was also the strategy employed by another great collector, the eccentric but scholarly Dr. Walter Leo Hilborough, seen here in 1920, whose tiny flat opposite the Victorian Albert Museum could hardly contain a single object of any size. Instead of concerning himself with matters of display, he concentrated all his resources and energy on collecting in discrete areas of mostly medieval antiquity and studying and publishing the pieces he had acquired in London or on his travels in Europe. Gave many of his papers and published much of his research actually at the Antiquaries here and in the Antiquaries Journal. The medieval objects, including his extraordinary collection of over 200 English medieval alabasters, were first lent and then given at different times to the V&A, so that Hilborough fulfilled a role as a sort of supernumerary curator, if somewhat unaccountable, even uncontrollable. The other great British collector of medieval art, the shipowner Sir William Burrell, was very different, much enjoying the search and bargaining for suitable objects, but preferring to have them around him, first in his large house in Glasgow, and then in the baronial surroundings of his home at Hutton Castle, here, essentially following in the footsteps of Samuel Merrick at Goodrich Court. His version of the Hôtel de Cluny incorporated several of the large medieval architectural features left over from William Randolph Hearst's decoration of San Simeon, numerous fine tapestries and stained glass panels, although the majority of the latter were not actually displayed until the collection was donated to the city of Glasgow and installed in its present building in Pollock Park. For the more precious items, he was advised by a small coterie of dealers, primarily Frank Sergi and John Hunt, who sourced the majority of his wood sculptures, ivories, and medieval bronzes. But it seems to me that the most admirable approach to incorporating a collection into a home was achieved by Robert von Hirsch in his house on the Engelgasse in Basel, which he moved into in 1933. He'd relocated there from Frankfurt, where he had formed a great friendship with Georg Swartzensky, the founding director of the Liebig House. Swartzensky became von Hirsch's mentor, and under his guidance, the latter was able to take advantage of the availability in the 1920s and early 1930s of remarkable medieval works of art from the Hohenzollern Sigmaringen collection, the Guelph treasure, the Hermitage in Leningrad, and other collections, including Figdor, Trivulzio, Pasavan Gontar, and Rucci. His collection of medieval treasures was not huge, but of great quality and importance, and it complemented perfectly the paintings, ceramics, books, and more modern sculpture in the house, seen here. Michael Stettler, the first curator of the Abeck-Stiftung in Riggisburg, described with charming enthusiasm a visit to the house, room by room, and how von Hirsch kept his medieval works of art together in his study. And I'll quote from this. Entering the room, the visitor would find RVH at his generous writing table near the window, newspapers, catalogues, and letters to hand. In the shadows of this room stood the legendary medieval showcase, you can see it there. With a light the host would switch on for the visitor's benefit, and whose contents were the real heart of the collection. Behind a large glass front was assembled a treasure trove of ecclesiastical and secular objects in ivory, bronze, and enamel. Reliquaries, candlesticks, croziers, chessmen, statuettes, and diptychs. The Byzantine ivory relief showing Christ in Majesty, formerly in the Trivulzio collection, a Limoges Eucharistic dove, a medallion from the Upper Rhine bearing a charming visitation, a casket from the Guelph treasure, and many other masterpieces. Like the pictures along the walls, the vitrine was arranged in order of merit by RVH. At the centre of the display was the medallion of the Operatio, the personification of charity as an angel from the Stavelot retable, and the curved armilla with the crucifixion and the figures of Longinus and Stephaton, possibly from Barbarossa's imperial vestment. You can see them more clearly there. On the table in front of the vitrine, between two aquamaniles, knelt a bronze female figure in the style of the doors of San Zeno in Verona, shading her eye with her hand. The observer too had to shade his eyes so as not to be blinded by the brilliance of this display. Now, notwithstanding Stettler's rather breathless hyperbole, the supreme quality of the medieval pieces of von Hirsch's collection was indeed confirmed and validated by the prices they fetched and by the homes they found after the great sale at Sotheby's in 1978. The Stavelot roundel, seen there, is now in the Kunstgewerbe Museum in Berlin, the Armilla in the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg. There's the Armilla. The candlestick with rock crystal knop in the Kessner Museum in Hanover. The reliquary casket with the enamel plaque of St. Matthew from the Guelph treasure is in the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum in Braunschweig. The ivories are in Cleveland and Stuttgart, amongst other places, and the eagle-eyed among you will spot several pieces that have passed to private collections, including the great Romanesque gilt copper candlestick and others. This one, which was for many years on loan to the Victorian Art Museum, is now in the Thompson collection in Toronto. A couple of decades after the great period of Robert von Hirsch collecting of medieval works of art, another preeminent collection was assembled, mostly in the 1950s, by Ernst and Martha Koffler-Truniger in Lucerne. Unlike that of von Hirsch, I haven't been able to find any views of the inside of the Koffler house, but there's a revealing photograph of one vitrine that contained nearly all the ivories, extraordinarily crowded, but for the fact that it lacked labels, indistinguishable from an early display of one of the world's great national museums. These ivory carvings, together with the outstanding collection of Limoges enamels, which were later acquired in toto by Edmund de Unger and became known as the Keir collection, subsequently broken up, were gathered together in an astonishingly short and concentrated period. And when they were shown with the rest of the collection in an exhibition at the Kunsthalle in Zurich in 1964, it was asserted quite reasonably that the collection, quote, is probably the last of its kind, for most of the categories represented so fully, and in particular the Western medieval ivories and enamels, seem in the last 2 or 3 years to have all but disappeared from the market. But of course, it's invariably the case that private collections such as this provide the materials for future collections, both public and private, and the writer of the review was not to know that at least 2 energetic private collectors would eventually take possession of many of the pieces in the photograph, and that one, the owner of the Wyvern collection, would surpass it. So, apart from the many pieces that have entered public collections, such as the Carolingian plaque in the centre, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a good number passed to important private collections, most notably the Thyssen-Bornemisza, the Thompson, and the Wyvern collection. And this is the Carolingian piece that's in the Met, and there are various pieces in the Thyssen collection. This is South Italian Baptism, Byzantine Virgin and Child. Pieces in the Thompson collection are this diptych here, the Wyvern collection, there's a crozier head, an Italian crozier head, this casket from Cologne, and a Byzantine crucifixion plaque from the center of a triptych, just to pick out 3 or 4. What do these displays have in common with their predecessors? What drove most of these collectors to set up their own private museums with showcases and plinths invading their living spaces? Robert von Hirsch knew, liked, and even quoted the views of the 18th century book collector, the Abbé du Lorrain, who perhaps provided the answer by explaining that his collection, like so many others, quote, nourishes the mind, strengthens the soul, and brings pleasure to the heart. He went on, I did not assemble my collection only for myself, however, and it is open to scholars and friends. I did not collect only for the pleasure to be derived from beauty, but in order to preserve examples of perfection for the future. If the portrait of Henry Walters we saw at the beginning of my talk exemplified the ideal image of the collector, these words could also serve as a fitting epitaph. But perhaps the final words should be those of Paul Toby of Nantes, the distinguished curator, collector, and scholar of Limoges enamels, shown here in a photograph of 1929. The pose is almost identical to that of the nearly contemporary image of Henry Walters, except that Toby is shown seated before a small showcase in his study, allowing him easy and instant access to his personal treasures, mostly consisting of Gothic ivory carvings. Like many other collectors of medieval works of art we've looked at this evening, He clearly enjoyed the experience of relaxing in a quasi-museum setting and recounted how, quote, often in the evening, to forget the troubles of the day, I get close to my ivories, certain to always find in them a new joy. And when I feel under my fingers the precious caress of the worn and polished ivory, I dream of the many hands that held it before me. My dreams may make you smile, but they are the dreams of a collector, and that will be my excuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. We have seen a lot and admired a lot and learned a lot, I hope, and perhaps been troubled by one or two images. So I'd like to ask people if they've got any questions. Paul's happy to answer questions, I think.
Of course.
And there's a microphone here, I think. I don't know. And there's a microphone, as a sort of a duelist, but with a microphone. Thank you. Who's going to carry it around? So John at the back, I see.
Thank you. Paul, thank you very much indeed for a really stimulating talk. Two possibly interconnected questions. The first is, do you think that medieval objects are presented by collectors in a distinctive way from those of any other kind of collection in their period? So is there anything specific about them? And the second thing possibly related to that is that I know the wall between collectors and dealers is very thin often. And I wonder whether we underestimate the importance of the way dealers present things as a way of informing the way that collectors present them. And I suppose there of someone like Thomas Hope, where the presentation of the material is crucially important to his sale of the material. Two thoughts.
Yes. No, that's a good point, John. And certainly a number of the illustrations I showed of the early display of objects had a mixture of works of art. They weren't just medieval, of course. They had all sorts of things, not, in some cases, not even works of art, but curiosities from history and so on. And indeed, I'm sure that if I was giving a lecture, or somebody was giving a lecture on the display of Renaissance works of art, they would probably show rather similar displays. After all, there are only so many ways you can show objects on shelves in a room, aren't there? But I think, having said that, that there are instances of people who are particularly interested in medieval material culture attempting to show or being influenced by how objects such as reliquaries were shown in things like armoire, which they might have seen, which they could well have seen if they were particularly engaged, as we know many of these collectors were in the 19th century. But, of course, many collectors do not just collect medieval works of art, they collect other pieces as well, and they're sometimes extremely interested in the juxtapositions of different pieces from different ages, and that's one of the reasons why many of them collect. They have an intellectual curiosity that thinks, how is this medieval piece connected with this classical piece, or so on. So I think it's difficult to be absolutely categorical about there being a particular type of way of displaying medieval works of art. Does that answer your question? It's not a terribly satisfactory answer, I know. Secondly, dealers, yes. As you saw, quite a number of the illustrations I showed of the influential Parisian dealers in the late 19th, early 20th century must have provided the lead for a number of collectors, and clearly, just as today, there are close links between collectors and their principal dealers. They would have been talking all the time. They would have been taking advice about how objects could be securely displayed, but still attractively displayed. And of course, dealers, it's their business to show objects as best they can, so they look appetizing and are likely to be snapped up. So they are, in many cases, extremely adept at showing. I always think in the present day, I shouldn't perhaps name names, but I will. I mean, Danny Katz, who is a well-known sculpture dealer, probably known to many of you, is an absolute master at showing works of art, you know, by putting them on rotating pedestals and things like that, having a single dedicated room showing these pieces centrally with strong light, top lighting and so on. And transforms as many times has transformed quite ordinary looking objects into extremely expensive looking objects. You know, so I think an awful lot of expertise does reside, obviously, with people who are providing the objects.
Thank you, Paul. That was really fascinating. To what extent, if any, do you think that the collectors express their religious identity in the collections that they formed?
Well, it goes from the fairly obvious, like Schnutgen, who clearly, you know, was a man of the cloth, and saw it as his role to go around collecting dispersed treasures with an idea that although he would live with them during his lifetime, ultimately they would end up in the Museum Schnutgen in Cologne. And, you know, he was a driven man, you know, who went and could hardly spend a week without picking up a crucifix figure or a thurible or what have you. And clearly, you know, he was driven by his faith and his desire to bring back into the possession of the church through him, and ultimately, I suppose, it passed then to the state, religious works of art. But a good number of other collectors, I mean, that one thinking of, I mean, look at Walters, look at Morgan, you get the feeling that they were looking at other aspects rather than the quite clearly religious significance of the works of art. They were looking at craftsmanship, they were looking at, you know, valuable materials, the pure virtuosity of the craftsman. And so in many cases, I don't think it would have made any difference whether or not an object was Christian or Buddhist or classical Roman. What they were interested in was the creative process, facture, and so on. But of course, there's a wide spectrum of why people collected. So I don't think one could be too specific.
I have a remote question from Julia Fires, who thanks you for a wonderfully rich talk and asks whether there were major female private collectors, individual ones rather than as part of a couple, as they were conspicuous in their absence from your talk.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. And obviously there's partly to do with access to wealth, but of course there may well be people in the room who could provide illustrations.
Does Lady Pomfret collect?
Not that
Asks John Goodall.
Not that I'm aware of, unless you can. Yeah, yes. She is an independent woman. Yes, yes. No, I don't believe so.
Of course, my memory. Is it Elizabeth Emery? Yes, is the author who's written on 19th century collecting. Her recent book was on a woman collector in Paris who she believed had been underrepresented. And the house still exists in Paris. But of course, I can't think of the name of this woman collector now. Mm-hmm. It's in the Burlington somewhere, reviewed.
Well, no, I'll look into this. I'll look into this further, but it wasn't a conscious decision on my part to exclude place. But I just, and of course, even with the male collectors, I was being extremely selective. There, of course, dozens more that I haven't mentioned, which I could have brought up for discussion.
May I keep the microphone and ask a question? Paul, that was a wonderful series of cases that you presented, chronologically, really, after your start. from the Middle Ages to today. And you alerted us also to changes that happened. For example, you said Schloss Ambras presented things in a very different way from the medieval treasuries. So my question is really, what do you think weighs heavier here? Do you really see a development here happening? Or are these individual cases with individual case studies, which each in the end had their own agenda, some with a more religious agenda, as Michael said? Should we see them in connection? Should we trace something back to the Middle Ages here, is my question.
Well, I think, as I suggested in my talk, that there are clear connections between the later collections. I mean, the early modern collections of works of art and curiosities, and the medieval treasuries. But of course, there are vital differences as well. I mean, I think that fascination with ordering different works of art, different objects as well, everything from narwhal tusks hanging from the ceiling through to shells and wonders of nature, was something that was a later development, really, than obviously that you would see in the medieval treasuries. The major difference, of course, I suppose, is to do with the question of accessibility, is it not?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your kind words. I just touch on this subject raised by Alexandra. One particular interesting case I've come across is at Laycock, where Sharrington, as you know, I'm sure, added in the 16th century this tower with a treasure room to the former monastery. But when you look very carefully at the plans and things, it's extremely interesting that the room in the tower, that is the treasure room, opened directly out of the former treasure room in the monastery. So you do have a sort of strange continuity at that point of moving from medieval storage to Kunstkammer in the modern sense of the word. And I often wonder whether in this treasure room he did move objects that had formerly been in the monastic treasure room. So there is a link there.
Thank you. No, that's very useful to know. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I'll go again to Laycock as soon as I can. Have a good look at that.
Thank you, Paul, for that really fascinating talk. Can I ask about class with these collectors? And obviously there's a huge variety, so we can only kind of generalize. But do you think it would be broadly true to say that most these collectors of medieval art are not coming from the kind of high levels of aristocracy, that they're going for Greco-Roman stuff, and that a lot of these collectors that there's a different kind of person who's going for medieval antiquities, if you like?
That's an interesting point, a very good question, because of course, if one thinks of the Grand Tour, of course, the vast majority of the people who went on the Grand Tour and brought back classical antiquities, Roman statues, Greek statues, and so on, were the aristocracy. They didn't tend to bring back medieval objects, as far as one could know. I mean, off the top of my head. It was a very different clientele. The dates are slightly different, of course. I mean, the great Grand Tourist was collecting slightly earlier than the great efflorescence of medieval collecting, which tended to come in from the 1820s, 1830s, and onwards. That's a good point, Tom. I can't think of a particularly strong aristocratic collections in medieval art. Of course, there are paintings, if you think of Trecento paintings, and there are collections of goldbacks, aren't there, in country houses which were collected in the 19th century, which you might think of as medieval, but not certainly liturgical items or reliquaries.
Sorry, just thinking about people at the Scaris bricks, other Catholic gentry families in the 19th century, assembling large amounts of medieval and early Renaissance works of art, but often it's for the furnishing of their private chapels. But they do, in a sense, have a collection, and there's certainly aesthetic considerations, but there's also that issue of faith, religious identity, and also trying to lend a ancient Catholic past to the new Pugin-built chapels. And gosh, what's the family? The Gages, isn't it? That remarkable chapel that they built, sadly demolished, and the furnishings acquired from across Europe. An amazing assemblage of medieval art.
And likewise, the installation of stained glass programs in the using continental glass that was imported from the early 19th century onwards. I mean, that is a phenomenon which ties in with what you've just described in private chapels.
How good were these early collectors at detecting forgeries? Were they taken in? Did they spot forgeries and reject them?
Forgeries of medieval works of art were really produced from about the 1850s onwards. There weren't very many before then. So the earlier collectors were much closer to the source of where they were getting the pieces from. I mean, often, the French Revolution produced a huge number of broken up, treasuries were broken up at that time, and huge amounts of works of art, and the Napoleonic Wars in the Lower Rhine and so on, produced a huge amount of works, genuine works of art. I think it was only when you get to the second half of the 19th century where possibly demand outstrips supply, and works of art are being published as well with good colour illustrations which allowed forgers and restorers to actually produce new pieces that they come in with a vengeance. And at that time, of course, from the 1850s, 1860s onwards, yes, many private collectors were duped often, and those pieces do still keep coming back into the market from time to time, even though you might know that they've been in a collection in 1870. It doesn't make them genuine. And they, in many cases, if you've been around for a long time, these objects keep popping up in the art trade, and, only to be dismissed. So yes, I think that the late 19th century, early 20th century collectors were often duped, which is why it was so important for them to have experienced dealers that they trusted, or even academics that they could call on to advise them.
Well, I think you sort of started to cover it. I was going to ask actually about the French Revolution. Partly in relation to what Tom was saying, actually, that you cut the grand tour at that point, and there's this vast supply of new material which starts to be traded from sort of 1800 onwards. The extent to which that actually, in creating a market, encourages new buyers, and the sort of material that's being brought online isn't classical statuary. It is, in fact, from mostly monastic and ecclesiastical buildings. The extent to which actually that encourages a market which allows collectors to flourish.
Oh, undoubtedly. Without the objects, there could be no market, it's no accident that the numbers of collectors grew exponentially after the objects became available in large numbers, and this was repeated again with the reunification of Italy and so on, and Spanish unrest and so on. When objects became available, the number of collectors, of course, grew alongside that, as you'd expect.
Well, it's two-sided, actually. First of all, who was allowed to see these collections? Did they have sort of open days, or were they just who aficionados were allowed in under strict security rules?
When are you talking about? Are you talking
The
about
collections, these
in
collections
the
that we've
19th
been-
century
in
or
the 19th century? Well, any
yes.
time.
No, as I said, I mean, it depended, as it does now, on how keen the owner of the collection was to share what he had with like-minded souls. I mean, as I said, Basilevsky basically had his collection open on 2 days a week in Paris, so people could come. Others kept them to themselves and only showed them to a small number of dealers, probably partly to do with security, but it's my experience that certainly collectors today obviously they do like sharing their pleasure in the objects that they have with others who have the same enthusiasms, and that's part of the joy of owning a collection, isn't it?
Thank you, Paul. That was really, really fascinating. I actually don't have a question. I just have a comment because the name came back to me. But just to come back to the earlier point, to have women represented, we handled a couple of objects from the collection of the Comtesse Martine de Behague, who was a 19th century woman collector, lived in Paris,
Yes.
really kind of beautiful, glamorous woman, had a boat that she sailed around called Nirvana, and she had a large collection of, we sort of looked at very early materials, kind of Visigothic, Ostrogothic objects, but just to kind of have a woman
No, there was
represented
that
here.
sale, wasn't there, about 20 years ago in
Exactly, at Sotheby's.
Paris, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up there. We've had a lot of questions, been very productive and entertaining as well as educative sessions. I'm not sure I need this. Apparently the YouTube's crashed. Oh, well, sorry, folks. It hasn't. In any case, please join me in thanking Paul again for a wonderful lecture. You did get bits and pieces of narwhals and griffins and things in these medieval treasures.
Oh, yes, that's I always think, have you ever been to Santo Grande Canal?
I've never been there.
Wonderful place. And there they